You may have seen in the news recently about the Federal Reserve thinks that inflation is too low. And currently we have a new Federal Reserve chairperson, Janet Yellen, coming into office next year, who will be replacing Bernanke. Now, Bernanke thinks the same thing that Yellen thinks. They do not think anything different here. The difference is that Bernanke is a little bit more cautious with how he expresses his views. Yellen is not. But as you can see in the New York Times, just as proof that I am actually getting this from the actual media, you see that in Fed and out, many now think inflation helps. The reason why I want to highlight this is because in discussing Generation Y and their future, Generation Y is facing numerous obstacles. And one of those obstacles is going to be this inflation that we now have a Federal Reserve chairperson in office next year who is actually going to try to encourage inflation. Keep in mind, Yellen thinks that 2% inflation is too low. So let's just look at that. I mean, what does 2% inflation look like, right? I mean, because a lot of people in Generation Y, and if you're watching this video, by the way, from another country, let me just explain something. Most Americans are really bad at math, and they don't really know anything about numbers. So, for instance, Janet Yellen can say things like 2% inflation is too low, and a lot of Americans would actually believe that. They don't realize how bad 2% inflation is. So we're going to look at this, and if you doubt my example here, you can do the code yourself, but I'm actually going to run code. I'm not going to run it on a front-end application like C#. I'm just going to do this all back-end. And we're going to run code here, and what this does is this is going to look at our amount of $100,000, 2% inflation over 30 years. And what this is going to show us, it's going to return a table, and that table is going to show you what inflation does over 30 years. So here's our original amount of $100,000. At the end of our year, we're down to $98,000. This is 2% inflation. So what does that look like after 10 years? So here's our 10-year point. We start out 10-year with $83,000. We end year 10 with $81,707. $81,707. By year 30, we end up with $54,548. That's what $100,000 became in 30 years. And that's 2% inflation, which, according to Yellen, is too low. Okay, let's just suppose, logically speaking, the Federal Reserve decides to start targeting 3% inflation, which if she thinks that 2% inflation is too low, I highly doubt she'll think that 3% inflation is enough. I think she'll probably target 4 or 5% inflation. But let's just look at 3% inflation over 30 years. In 10 years, our $100,000 becomes $73,742. So in 10 years, basically, they just took $27,000 from you. In 30 years, $100,000 becomes $40,100. 3% inflation over 30 years of original amount of $100,000. So when the Federal Reserve says that 2% inflation is too low, understand what they're saying is over 30 years, they would like to take 46% of your savings. And if you think about it from a taxing perspective, that's beautiful because, especially in America, again, most Americans don't know anything about math, so it's an invisible tax, right? And most people don't actually see this. And I'll put this table in front of people, and they'll be like, well, blah, 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 and they'll start making excuses. And again, for those of you, by the way, who are coders, I'm going to give you some time to look at this. That way you can see how this is done, and you can duplicate this yourself. But the thing is that nobody's actually seeing their money dissipate in front of them, right? It's not like, a 30% income tax where you actually see. Instead, it's this invisible tax that you're not seeing. But if I come along and I say, yeah, 2% or 3% inflation is too low, that should be an immediate concern because as you see, over a 30-year time frame, you're basically taking 45% of people's savings. That's a huge deal, especially for retirees. And you would think that, the older generation would be very concerned about that, because if they think that 2% inflation is too low, they're going to come along and tax older people even more. But let's talk about Generation Y for a second, because with Generation Y, if we're talking about 3% inflation, it means that one of Generation Y's opportunity of saving money, that actually they're going to start getting that opportunity hit. And so essentially the Federal Reserve is going along with the government and taxing you even more, because they're taking more of your savings away from you. This makes it more difficult to buy a home. This makes it more difficult to pay for medical expenses when it comes up. This makes it more difficult just to live. I mean, usually the prices that get smacked the most are energy and food, because, again, the Federal Reserve conveniently leaves those out. And they'll claim they leave them out because of volatility. Understand that's their reason, but recognize that food and energy can go up very high, especially in high inflationary periods. And by the way, if you doubt anything that I'm saying here, you can always sit down and talk to someone who's gone through a period of, let's say, double-digit inflation, and they'll tell you how terrible that was relative to what we're going through now, where our unemployment rate's 7%. Oh my gosh, it's 7%. But, in the 70s, we had double-digit unemployment and double-digit inflation, what they call stagflation, which is far worse. Our problems right now are not near as bad as they could be. That's why when people talk about this being the Great Recession, that's a joke. The 70s were much worse than this is. So, for Generation Y, one of the reasons why I'm bearish against home ownership, one of the reasons why I don't see Generation Y going out there and buying homes, is you now have someone who got into the Federal Reserve who thinks 2% inflation is too low. And if we look at 2% inflation again, it's a huge, huge tax. We're talking about taking away basically 45% of someone's wealth. That's not an economy in which Generation Y is going to be able to save for retirement or be able to buy a home. It's not going to be feasible whatsoever. High inflation is not good. There is also another related note here while I'm on the topic of inflation. A few years ago, I mentioned to a friend that it would be much wiser if he converted all of his currency to the Chinese RMB instead of holding on to the US dollar. And this past year, I got into an argument with, again, my apologies to foreigners here, but most Americans are not very smart people. And so they don't understand anything about math. So there was a dumb American who was trying to argue with me about the fact that, well, China has a lot of inflation, so you wouldn't want to hold on to the Chinese RMB because they have high inflation. And my point to him was, actually, relative to what the US dollar is doing, you don't look at a foreign currency as to what the local inflation is doing in the foreign currency if it's not affecting its value against the US dollar. This is a case in point. Let's suppose, and China does have higher inflation right now, but it's still appreciating against the dollar. Since 2004, the Chinese RMB is up 36% against the dollar, which is one of the currencies that I'm bullish on, in the sense that probably in the next 60 years, the Chinese RMB will go 1-to-1 for the dollar, which means eventually $1 will only buy one Chinese RMB. Right now, $1 buys about 6. Well, the thing is that, okay, so China may have 4% inflation, but a jar of Laura Scudder's peanut butter, which I buy, for $2.32 has stayed $2.32 for the last 10 years since I've been buying it. Well, if I had put all my money into savings instead of the US dollar, put it into the Chinese RMB, I could have purchased 36.1% more Laura Scudder's peanut butter. So regardless of the inflation in China, it doesn't matter if it's still going up relative to the US dollar. Then when I convert that currency here in the US back to US dollars, I can still buy more of local goods here. So China can have 4% inflation. Who cares? If it's causing their currency to go down, yes, then it's a concern. But if they're 4% inflation, their currency is still appreciating against the dollar, that's all that matters. Because again, many of the same goods that we've bought in the last 10 years, Americans take this for granted. Again, this is the whole Federal Reserve, 2% inflation is too low. But Americans have actually been able to buy items for a long time that have stayed relatively the same price. And when you start to see higher inflation, they'll immediately realize why that is a much, much worse deal for all of us.